The boundary stone stood gray and weathered where the territories met, half buried in wild grass that bent beneath the autumn wind, and Vaughn Thatcher had come to leave his younger brother's sword there as the old traditions demanded, though his hands shook with more than grief as he knelt in the fading light. The war had taken Marcus 3 days ago in a skirmish that meant nothing, changed nothing, solved nothing, and now Vaughn was supposed to leave this blade and walk away as if a century of bloodshed could be honored by one more meaningless ritual. He had not expected to see her. She stood on the other side of the boundary stone, perhaps 20 paces distant, her green skin catching the last rays of sunset until she seemed to glow like spring leaves. She was tall, built strong as the oaks that lined the disputed borderlands, and the small tusks that curved upward from her lower jaw gleamed white against her full lips. Her dark hair was braided back from her face, and she wore the leather and rough cloth of the orc clans, practical and worn. In her hands, she held a small bundle wrapped in faded blue fabric. They stared at each other across the ancient stone, and Vaughn's first instinct was to reach for the sword he had been about to lay down. His second instinct, stranger and more unsettling, was to simply look at her, to notice the way sorrow shadowed her eyes, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she carried a weight too heavy to bear. "I did not think any of your kind still honored the old ways," she said, and her voice was deeper than human women's voices, but not harsh. There was something musical in it, something that reminded him of the wind in the pines. "I did not think any of yours did either," Vaughn replied, and his own voice sounded rough to his ears, scraped raw by 3 days of silent grief. She took a step closer to the stone, and he saw that her eyes were amber, like honey held up to lamplight. "I came to leave this," she said, lifting the bundle slightly. "My sister wore this shawl. She was killed by your soldiers 4 days ago. She was gathering herbs. She had no weapon." The words hit Vaughn like fists to his chest, and he looked down at the sword in his hands. "My brother died 3 days ago. He was barely 17. He did not want to be a soldier, but our father insisted. He wanted to be a carpenter." The orc woman's expression shifted, something painful moving across her features. "My sister was 16. She wanted to be a healer. Our mother tried to keep her from the borderlands, but she said the best herbs grew here." They stood in silence then, the boundary stone between them like a monument to all the years of hatred, all the lives lost to a war that neither of them could remember the true beginning of. The stories changed depending on who told them. The humans said the orcs had invaded first, burned villages, stolen land. The orcs said the humans had come like locusts, taking and taking until there was nothing left to give. Vaughn did not know which story was true anymore. He was not sure it mattered. "What is your name?" he asked, surprising himself. She hesitated, and he understood why. To give your name to the enemy was to make yourself vulnerable, to acknowledge that you were a person and not just a monster in their stories. But then she lifted her chin slightly, and there was defiance in the gesture, courage that he recognized because he had seen it in his brother's eyes the morning Marcus had left for the front. "Gretna," she said. "Gretna Ironfoot of the northern clans, Vaughn Thatcher," he replied. "Of the Southridge Valley settlements." Gretna moved closer to the boundary stone, and Vaughn found himself doing the same, drawn by something he could not name. When they were close enough that he could have reached out and touched her if he had been foolish enough to try, she knelt down and placed her sister's shawl on the stone. Her fingers lingered on the fabric, smoothing it gently. "Her name was Mara," Gretna said softly. "She sang while she worked. Our mother used to say she could make the stones themselves smile." Vaughn knelt as well, laying his brother's sword beside the shawl. The blade looked brutal next to the soft blue fabric, a cruel contrast that made his throat tighten. Marcus whistled, he said. Drove everyone mad with it, but he was so happy when he did it. He could not carry a tune to save his life, but he whistled anyway. They knelt there together, two mourners on opposite sides of a century-old war, and Vaughn felt something crack open inside his chest. He had cried when he learned of Marcus's death, had raged and shouted and broken things, but this was different. This was a quieter grief, shared and somehow more bearable for being witnessed by someone who understood. "Do you ever wonder," Gretna said after a long moment, "what it would be like if things were different, if our peoples did not hate each other?" Vaughn looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a monster but a woman who had lost her sister, who knelt in the grass grieving just as he did. "I wonder it now," he said. She met his eyes and something passed between them, fragile as spider silk but real. Then she stood and he stood with her, and they backed away from the boundary stone, from the offerings they had left there, from the moment that had felt like stepping outside of time itself. "Will you come again?" Vaughn asked, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Gretna paused, and he saw the war in her expression, the fear and the longing and the impossibility of what he was suggesting. "I should not," she said. "But will you?" She was quiet for so long that he thought she would not answer. Then, just as she turned to go, she said, "Perhaps. If you come as well." Then she was walking away, her figure growing smaller against the darkening sky, and Vaughn stood watching until she disappeared into the trees on her side of the border. Only then did he turn toward home, toward the empty house that awaited him, toward the life that had been hollowed out by loss. But something had shifted. Something had been planted in that moment at the boundary stone, small and secret and dangerous. The next week, Vaughn found excuses to ride out to the borderlands. He told himself he was checking the fence lines, looking for damage from the recent storms, making sure none of the livestock had wandered too far. He did not admit, even to himself, that he was hoping to see her again. She was there on the 8th day, standing by the boundary stone as if she had been waiting. The sword and the shawl were gone, claimed by the old magic that was supposed to carry such offerings to the spirits of the dead, and the stone stood bare except for the lichen that clung to its surface. "You came," Vaughn said, and he could not keep the relief from his voice. "I told myself I would not," Gretna replied. "I told myself it was foolish and dangerous and wrong, but you came anyway." "But I came anyway," she agreed, and there was something like a smile at the corner of her mouth, tentative and uncertain but real. They did not cross the boundary. That would have been too much, too dangerous for both of them. Instead, they sat on their respective sides of the stone and talked, their voices low as if they feared being overheard even though there was no one for miles around. Gretna told him about her clan, about the way they lived in the high country where the pine trees grew so thick that the forest floor was carpeted in shadow. She told him about her mother, who was a weaver, and her father, who had died in the war when she was small. She told him about Mara, about the little sister who had followed her everywhere, who had believed that the world could be healed if only people tried hard enough. Vaughn told her about the valley, about the farm where he had grown up, about the way the wheat fields turned gold in the summer, and how the river ran so cold and clear that you could see every stone on its bottom. He told her about Marcus, about teaching his brother to fish and hunt and fix the things that broke. He told her about his father, bitter and angry and consumed by hatred for the orcs, and how Vaughn had tried to shield Marcus from that hatred but failed. "You hate us?" Gretna asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made Vaughn's heart ache. "I was taught to," he said honestly. "From the time I could understand words, I was taught that orcs were monsters, that they would kill us all if given the chance. But then I met you, and you are not a monster." You are just someone who lost her sister, someone who came to grieve. Gretna looked down at her hands, at the calluses and scars that marked them. I was taught the same about humans, that you were cruel and greedy, that you would destroy everything beautiful in the world. But you loved your brother, you came to honor him. That is not cruelty. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Vaughn knew he should go. It was dangerous to be out here after dark, dangerous for both of them. But he did not want to leave, did not want to break the fragile connection that was forming between them. "Will you come again?" he asked, echoing the question from their first meeting. "Will you?" Gretna countered. "Yes," Vaughn said, and it felt like a promise, like a vow. "Then I will too," she said. They met 3 more times over the next month, always at the boundary stone, always in the late afternoon when the shadows grew long and they could talk without fear of being seen. With each meeting they grew bolder, more comfortable. They laughed together, shared stories that had nothing to do with war or death. Gretna told him about the time she had tried to train a young wolf cub, and it had eaten her favorite boots. Vaughn told her about the harvest festival where he had drunk too much cider and fallen into the pig trough. But they still kept to their respective sides of the boundary, still maintained the distance that safety demanded. It was during their 5th meeting that the weather turned. Autumn had given way to early winter, and the wind that whipped across the borderlands was bitter and sharp. Gretna arrived wrapped in a heavy cloak, her cheeks flushed from the cold, and Vaughn had brought a skin of hot tea that his neighbor had given him. "You are shivering," he observed, watching the way she hunched against the wind. "It is colder than I expected," she admitted. The weather in the high country changes quickly, but this wind cuts through everything. Vaughn looked at the boundary stone between them, at the invisible line that kept them apart, and made a decision. "Come over to my side," he said. "There is a stand of trees just there, enough to block the wind. We can sit in the shelter." Gretna stared at him, her amber eyes wide. "Cross the boundary." "It is just a line," Vaughn said, though his heart was pounding. "Just rocks and grass. It does not have to be a wall." For a moment he thought she would refuse, would turn and leave and never come back. But then she stood, gathered her cloak around her, and stepped across the boundary stone onto the human side of the border. It felt monumental, that single step. It felt like the world should shake, like lightning should strike, like something should happen to mark the significance of an orc woman choosing to trust a human man enough to enter his territory. But the world kept turning, the wind kept blowing, and they were just 2 people seeking shelter from the cold. They settled beneath the trees, sitting closer than they ever had before, and Vaughn poured tea into 2 cups he had brought. Gretna wrapped her hands around the cup, and he saw the way her fingers dwarfed it, strong and capable. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the tea, for the shelter." "Thank you for trusting me enough to cross," Vaughn replied. They drank in silence for a while, and Vaughn found himself acutely aware of her presence, of the way she smelled like pine smoke and herbs, of the warmth that radiated from her despite the cold. He had never been this close to an orc before, not without weapons and armor between them, and he was struck by how human she seemed, how familiar despite all the ways she was different. "Can I ask you something?" Gretna said, breaking the silence. "Anything? Why do you keep coming here? You could be safe at home, warm by your fire. Why risk this?" Vaughn thought about how to answer, about how to put into words the thing that had been growing inside him since their first meeting. "Because when I am here with you, I feel less alone," he said finally. "Because you are the only person who understands what it is like to lose someone to this war and still question whether it has to continue. Because when I talk to you, I remember that there is more to life than grief and hatred." Gretna set down her cup, and when she looked at him, There were tears in her eyes. "I come for the same reasons," she said. "I come because you make me feel seen, because you listen when I talk about Mara and you do not tell me to be strong or to move on. Because when I am with you, I can imagine a world where things are different." Vaughn's hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching out to touch her arm, and she did not pull away. Through the fabric of her cloak, he could feel the solidness of her, the strength, and something shifted in his chest, something warm and bright and terrifying. "Gretna," he said, and her name felt precious in his mouth, like something rare and valuable. "Vaughn," she replied, and the way she said his name made him feel like he was someone worth knowing, someone worth the risk she was taking. They sat like that as the sun set, his hand on her arm, her eyes on his face, and the world narrowed down to just the two of them. Just this moment, just this impossible connection that neither of them fully understood but both of them needed. When full dark fell, they finally pulled apart and Gretna stood to go. "I should return before I am missed," she said. "When will I see you again?" Vaughn asked. 3 days, she said. "I will come back in 3 days." But she did not come back in 3 days. Vaughn waited at the boundary stone as the afternoon stretched into evening, as the cold seeped into his bones, and his hope began to curdle into worry. He waited until the stars came out, until he could no longer deny that something was wrong. He returned the next day and the day after that, but the orc side of the border remained empty, and the boundary stone stood silent and alone. On the 4th day, Vaughn made a choice that he knew was reckless, possibly suicidal. He crossed the boundary stone and walked into orc territory, following the game trails that Gretna had mentioned, heading toward the high country where the pines grew thick. He had never been so frightened in his life. Every sound made him jump. Every shadow seemed to hide enemies. He imagined arrows piercing his chest, axes splitting his skull, all the terrible deaths that his people had warned him orcs would inflict. But he kept walking because the alternative, never knowing what had happened to Gretna, was worse than any death his imagination could conjure. He found the orc settlement as the sun was beginning to set, a collection of sturdy wooden buildings nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could hear voices, the sounds of normal life. He crept closer, keeping to the shadows, searching for any sign of her. Then he saw her, and his heart stopped. Gretna was tied to a post in the center of the settlement, her face bruised and swollen, her clothes torn. Around her stood a group of orcs, and from their posture and the way the others deferred to them, Vaughn guessed they were the clan elders. One of them, an enormous male with scars covering his arms and chest, was shouting at her in the orc language, his voice harsh and angry. Vaughn did not speak the orc tongue, but he did not need to understand the words to know what was happening. Someone had discovered her meetings with him. Someone had seen her cross the boundary, and now she was being punished for the crime of showing kindness to the enemy. He should have stayed hidden. He should have waited for a better opportunity, should have made a plan. But seeing her hurt, seeing her tied and helpless, burned away every bit of caution he possessed. Vaughn stood and walked into the settlement, his hands raised to show he was unarmed, and the effect was immediate. Orcs shouted, weapons appeared from nowhere, and within seconds he was surrounded by warriors who looked more than ready to kill him. "Wait," he shouted, hoping someone would understand. "Please wait." The scarred orc who had been yelling at Gretna pushed through the crowd, his eyes blazing with fury. "A human," he snarled in heavily accented human speech. "A human dares to enter our lands." "I came for her," Vaughn said, nodding toward Gretna. "Let her go. Punish me if you need to punish someone, but let her go." Gretna was staring at him with an expression of horror and disbelief. Vaughn, no, she said, her voice breaking. You should not be here. You need to run. I am not leaving without you, he said. The scarred orc laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. You think you can bargain for a traitor. You think your life is worth anything to us. She is not a traitor, Vaughn said, and he was surprised by the strength in his own voice. She mourned her sister. She talked with someone who understood her grief. If that is treachery, then your definition of loyalty is twisted. The orc's hand moved to the axe at his belt, and Vaughn thought his life was about to end right there in that clearing. But then another voice spoke, older and weighted with authority. Stop, Goran. An elderly orc woman stepped forward, and the crowd parted for her with a respect that bordered on reverence. She was small for an orc, bent with age, but her eyes were sharp and missing nothing. She studied Vaughn for a long moment, then turned to look at Gretna. You are the human my granddaughter has been meeting, the old woman said, and it was not a question. Yes, Vaughn said. My name is Vaughn Thatcher. I met Gretna at the boundary stone after we both came to honor our dead. We have done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong, Goran spat. She has been consorting with the enemy, sharing our secrets. I have shared no secrets, Gretna said, and despite her injuries, there was fire in her voice. I have told him nothing of our defenses, nothing of our numbers or strategies. We talked about our families, about the people we loved and lost. That is all. The old woman raised a hand, and Goran fell silent, though his expression remained murderous. I am Nara Ironfoot, she said to Vaughn. Gretna is my granddaughter. You claim you have done nothing wrong, but you have crossed the boundary, entered our lands without permission. That alone is cause for execution. Then execute me, Vaughn said. But let Gretna go. She has already lost her sister. Do not make her mother lose another daughter. Nara's expression shifted, something that might have been surprise flickering across her weathered features. You would die for her, for an orc. I would die for her because she is Gretna, Vaughn said simply. Because she is kind and brave, and the only good thing I have found in this whole cursed war. Her being an orc has nothing to do with it. The settlement had gone quiet, every orc listening to this exchange, and Vaughn could feel their eyes on him, weighing and judging. Nara circled him slowly, and he forced himself to stand still, to meet her gaze when she looked at him. You love her, Nara said, and again it was not a question. The words hit Vaughn like a revelation. He had not let himself think it, had not let himself name the feeling that had been growing stronger with each meeting, but hearing it spoken aloud, he knew it was true. Yes, he said, I love her. Gretna made a sound, half sob and half gasp, and when Vaughn looked at her, he saw tears streaming down her face. Nara was quiet for a long moment, and the silence stretched until Vaughn thought he would break from the tension of it. Then she said, Our peoples have been at war for 100 years. 100 years of death and grief and hatred, and in all that time, I have never heard of a human walking into an orc settlement and offering his life for one of ours. Then perhaps, Vaughn said carefully, it is time for something new. Goran made a sound of disgust. You would take the word of a human. They lie as easily as they breathe. He is not lying, Gretna said, and her voice was steady despite the tears. I know him. He speaks the truth. Nara looked at her granddaughter, and something passed between them, some communication that Vaughn could not read. Then the old woman sighed, and suddenly she looked very tired, very old. Cut her down, Nara said. Mother, no, Goran protested, and Vaughn realized this was Gretna's uncle, her mother's brother. I said cut her down, Nara repeated, and there was steel in her voice that brooked no argument. 2 orcs moved forward and sliced through the ropes binding Gretna to the post. She stumbled, and Vaughn moved without thinking, catching her before she fell. She was heavy, solid with muscle, but he held her steady as she found her feet. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder. "As for you," Nara said to Vaughn, "you will leave our lands now, you will not return. And you will not see my granddaughter again." The words were like a knife to his chest, but Vaughn nodded. He had expected death, and he had been granted life. He could not ask for more than that, even though it felt like his heart was being torn from his chest. "I understand," he said. But as he started to pull away from Gretna, she gripped his arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. "No," she said. "Grandmother, please." "You have already brought shame on this family," Goran said. "Do not make it worse." "Shame." Gretna turned to face her uncle, and Vaughn saw the warrior in her then, saw the strength that had let her survive in a world that demanded hardness. "The shame is that we have been killing each other for so long that we have forgotten how to be anything else. Mara did not die for territory or honor. She died gathering herbs to heal people. She died for nothing, just like Vaughn's brother died for nothing, just like all of them have died for nothing." "You dare speak of your sister," Goran began, but Gretna cut him off. "I dare speak of her because I loved her, and because her death broke something inside me that I thought could never be fixed. But then I met Vaughn, and he understood. He did not tell me to be strong or to hate more fiercely. He just listened and grieved with me, and that understanding was worth more than 100 years of war." The settlement was silent again, and Vaughn could see orcs in the crowd looking at each other, uncertain. Nara was watching her granddaughter with an expression Vaughn could not read, and for a moment he thought the old woman might relent. But then Goran spoke again. "If you choose the human over your clan, you will be cast out. You will be clanless, without family or protection. Is that what you want?" Gretna looked at Vaughn, and he saw the war in her eyes, the impossible choice she was being forced to make. He wanted to tell her it was all right, that she should stay with her people, that he would understand. But the words stuck in his throat because they would have been a lie. "I want," Gretna said slowly, "to live in a world where I do not have to choose between loving someone and being loyal to my family. I want to live in a world where my sister would still be alive, where Vaughn's brother would be making furniture instead of rotting in the ground. I want a world where we are better than this." "That world does not exist," Goran said flatly. "Then maybe we should create it," Gretna replied. Nara held up her hand again, and the gesture commanded immediate silence. She looked at Gretna, then at Vaughn, then back at her granddaughter. "You would truly leave everything for this human?" "I would leave everything for a chance at something better," Gretna said. "And yes, that includes him." The old woman closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet with tears. "Then go," she said, and her voice was heavy with sorrow. "Go and do not come back. You are no longer of the Ironfoot clan." Gretna swayed as if struck, and Vaughn tightened his hold on her. He had not wanted this, had not wanted her to sacrifice everything for him, but the decision had been made and there was no taking it back. "Grandmother," Gretna said, and the word was a plea. "I am not your grandmother anymore," Nara said, but she walked forward and pressed something into Gretna's hand. "But I was once, and for the sake of that, take this. It was your mother's before she married into this clan. Perhaps it will bring you luck." Gretna looked down at the object in her hand, a small carved stone on a leather cord, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Nara nodded once, then turned and walked away, and the crowd parted for her. Goran looked like he wanted to say more, to perhaps strike them both down, but without Nara's support, he could do nothing. He settled for spitting at Vaughn's feet before stalking away. The other orcs began to disperse, some casting sympathetic looks at Gretna, others glaring at Vaughn with undisguised hatred. Within minutes, the clearing was nearly empty, and Vaughn and Gretna stood alone in the gathering darkness. "We should go," Vaughn said quietly. Before they change their minds. Gretna nodded, and together they walked out of the settlement, past the buildings where she had grown up, past the places that held her whole history. She did not look back, but Vaughn could feel the way her body shook, could hear the raggedness of her breathing. They walked through the night, heading south toward the boundary stone and beyond it to human lands. Vaughn knew that taking her to his home was dangerous, that his people would be just as hostile as hers had been. But he could not leave her alone in the wilderness, hurt and cast out from everything she had known. When they finally stopped to rest, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. They were deep in the forest, far from any settlement, and the only sounds were birdsong and the whisper of wind through the leaves. Gretna sank down against a tree trunk and Vaughn sat beside her. She had been silent during the entire walk and he had not pushed her to talk, but now she turned to look at him, and the devastation in her eyes nearly broke him. "I am sorry," he said, the words utterly inadequate. "I am so sorry. I should not have come. I should not have put you in that position." "You came to save me," Gretna said. "You walked into an orc settlement knowing you would probably die, and you did it to save me. How can I be angry about that?" "Because you lost everything," Vaughn said. "Your family, your home, your whole life. All because of me." Gretna reached out and took his hand, her fingers rough and warm against his. "I lost my family because they could not see past 100 years of hatred. I lost my home because it had become a place where love was seen as betrayal. I did not lose everything, Vaughn. I chose something different." "But what will you do now?" he asked. "Where will you go?" "I was hoping," she said quietly, "that I might go with you, if you will have me." Vaughn's heart clenched and he brought her hand to his lips, kissing her scarred knuckles. "I will have you for as long as you will stay," he said. "But you need to understand that my people will not welcome you any more than yours welcomed me. It will be hard. It will be dangerous." "I know," Gretna said. "But I would rather face that with you than spend another day pretending that this war is just or right or worth the lives it has cost." They sat together as the sun rose higher, and despite everything they had lost, despite the uncertainty of the future, Vaughn felt something like hope stirring in his chest. The journey to Vaughn's farm took 2 more days, and they traveled carefully, avoiding the main roads and any places where they might encounter other people. Gretna's injuries were healing, the bruises fading from purple to yellow-green, but she was still weak, and Vaughn made sure they rested often. On the second night, they made camp beside a stream, and Vaughn caught fish for their dinner while Gretna gathered wood for the fire. It felt strangely domestic, this working together, and Vaughn found himself imagining what it would be like to do this every day, to build a life with her. As they ate, Gretna said, "Tell me about your farm. What is it like?" Vaughn thought about how to describe it, about how to make her see the place that had been his whole world before the war took Marcus. "It is small," he said. "Just a few fields and a vegetable garden, a barn for the animals. The house is old but solid, built by my grandfather. There is a view of the valley from the front porch, and in the spring the whole world turns green." "It sounds beautiful," Gretna said softly. "It was," Vaughn agreed. "Before the war took my brother, before my father died of fever last winter. Now it is just me, and the house feels too big and too quiet." Gretna was silent for a moment, and then she said, "Perhaps it will feel less quiet now." Vaughn looked at her across the fire, at the way the flames painted her skin in shades of gold and shadow, and felt his heart expand with something too big to name. "Perhaps it will," he said. That night, they slept close together for warmth, and Vaughn woke once to find Gretna's head resting on his shoulder, her breathing deep and even. He stayed very still, not wanting to wake her, and watched the stars wheel overhead until sleep claimed him again. They reached the farm in the late afternoon of the third day, and Vaughn felt anxiety twist his stomach as they approached. He had been gone for nearly a week, and he hoped the livestock had survived on their own, hoped nothing had broken or burned in his absence. But the farm looked the same as always, weathered and worn but standing. The chickens scratched in the yard, the cow lowed from the barn, and the house sat solid and welcoming on its foundation. "This is it," Vaughn said, unnecessarily. Gretna stood taking it all in, and he tried to see it through her eyes, tried to imagine what she thought of this human dwelling. Then she smiled, small and tentative, and said, "It feels like home." Something in Vaughn's chest eased at those words, and he led her inside, into the dim coolness of the house. It was dusty from his absence, and there were dishes in the sink and ash cold in the fireplace, but it was shelter and safety and theirs. "You should rest," Vaughn said. "You are still healing. I will take care of the animals and get the fire started." But Gretna shook her head. "Let me help. I am not an invalid, and I need to do something useful." So they worked together, feeding the animals and milking the cow and sweeping the floors. It felt right, this partnership, and Vaughn caught himself smiling as he worked, something he had not done since before Marcus died. As night fell, they sat together at the small kitchen table, eating bread and cheese and the last of the fish they had caught. Gretna looked around the room, and Vaughn saw her taking in the details. The carved wooden spoons that Marcus had made, the faded quilt his mother had sewn, the collection of smooth stones his father had gathered from the river. "These things tell stories," Gretna said, touching one of Marcus's spoons. "Stories of the people who lived here, the things they loved." "Yes," Vaughn said. "My mother loved to sew. She said that every stitch was a prayer for our protection. My father loved the river. He used to say that watching the water flow made him remember that nothing stayed the same forever. And Marcus loved to make things with his hands, to take raw wood and turn it into something beautiful and useful." "And you?" Gretna asked. "What do you love?" Vaughn met her eyes, and the truth came easily. "I love this land. I love the way the seasons change it, the way the wheat grows tall in the summer, and the way the snow blankets everything in winter. And I love you," he added, the words spilling out before he could second-guess them. "I know it is too soon to say it. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but it is true. I love you." Gretna's eyes widened, and for a moment he thought he had made a terrible mistake, had pushed too hard too fast. But then she reached across the table and took his hand, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "It is not too soon," she said. "Not when I feel the same way. Not when I gave up everything I knew because the thought of living without you was worse than being cast out. I love you too, Vaughn Thatcher." Vaughn stood and pulled her to her feet, and then he was kissing her, tasting the salt of her tears and the sweetness of her mouth. Her tusks were smooth against his lips, unfamiliar but not unpleasant, and when she wound her arms around him, he felt the strength in her, the solidity that made him feel safe in a way he had not felt since childhood. They held each other for a long time, and when they finally pulled apart, Gretna was smiling through her tears. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Vaughn said, "we figure out how to build a life together. It will not be easy. We will face hatred and fear from both our peoples. But we will face it together." "Together," Gretna echoed, and sealed the promise with another kiss. The first few weeks were the hardest. Vaughn's nearest neighbor, a widow named Alina who lived a mile down the road, came by to check on him and saw Gretna working in the garden. She screamed, actually screamed, and ran back to her own house as fast as her old legs could carry her. Within hours, half the valley knew that Vaughn Thatcher was harboring an orc, and a delegation arrived at his door demanding an explanation. Vaughn faced them on his porch with Gretna standing behind him and told them the truth. He told them about meeting her at the boundary stone, about their conversations, about her being cast out for refusing to hate him. Some of the people left in disgust. Others lingered, uncertain, looking at Gretna with a mix of fear and curiosity. It was old Thomas, the blacksmith, who finally spoke up. "She helped you with the work, you say?" "Yes," Vaughn replied. "She is a hard worker and skilled with her hands." Thomas studied Gretna for a long moment. "The war took my sons," he said. "Both of them. Killed by orcs in battles that did not matter for land that none of us will ever see. I have hated your kind for a long time, girl." Gretna lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "The war took my sister and my father and my uncle's 3 sons. I have hated your kind for a long time too." "And now?" Thomas asked. "Now I am tired of hating," Gretna said. "Now I want to build something instead of destroying it." Thomas was quiet, and then he nodded slowly. "Winter is coming. If you are still here in the spring, and if there has been no trouble, I will consider that maybe things can change. But if there is any hint that you are spying, any sign that you mean us harm, I will drive you out myself." "Understood." "Understood," Gretna said. It was not acceptance, but it was not outright rejection either, and Vaughn counted it as a victory. The delegation dispersed, and he and Gretna went back inside, both of them shaking with relief. "That could have been much worse," Vaughn said. "It will get worse," Gretna replied. "There will be people who cannot accept this, who will see me as a threat no matter what I do." She was right. Over the following weeks, there were incidents. Someone shot an arrow into their door in the middle of the night. Someone poisoned their well, and they had to dig a new one. Vaughn found crude drawings in the village showing orcs and humans in obscene positions, with his name scrawled underneath. But there were also small kindnesses. Eleanor, the widow who had screamed at the sight of Gretna, left a basket of apples on their porch with a note that said only, "For the winter." Thomas hired Gretna to help in his forge for a few days, paying her in iron nails and horseshoes that they needed for the farm. A young woman named Sarah brought her sick child to Gretna after hearing that orcs knew herb lore, and Gretna brewed a tea that broke the fever. Slowly, grudgingly, some of the valley folk began to see Gretna as a person rather than a monster. It helped that she worked hard, that she was unfailingly polite, that she did not rise to the insults and provocations that were sometimes hurled her way. And it helped that Vaughn stood by her always, making it clear that anyone who wanted to hurt her would have to go through him first. Winter came hard that year, with snow piling high and the wind howling down from the mountains. Vaughn and Gretna hunkered down in the farmhouse, keeping the fire burning and the animals fed. They spent long evenings talking, learning each other's languages and customs, and longer nights wrapped in each other's arms, finding warmth and comfort and joy despite the cold world outside. On the longest night of winter, the solstice, Gretna taught Vaughn the old orc songs about the turning of the year, about darkness giving way to light. Her voice was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, deep and resonant, and he listened with his eyes closed, memorizing every note. When she finished, he said, "In the spring I want to marry you, by human custom, by orc custom, by whatever ritual you want. I want the whole world to know that you are mine and I am yours." Gretna's eyes shone in the firelight. "Human and orc marriages are different," she said. "Human ceremonies are about property and alliances. Orc ceremonies are about choosing your kin, about declaring who you will stand with in battle and in peace." "Then we will do both," Vaughn said. "We will create our own ceremony, one that honors both our peoples and the new thing we are building." "A new thing," Gretna repeated, and she smiled. I like that. Not human or orc, but something else. Something better. The winter passed and spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal the earth beneath. Vaughn and Gretna planted the fields together, working side by side in the mud and sun, and Vaughn could not remember ever being happier. The work was hard, but it was good work, and doing it with her made it feel like they were planting more than just wheat and vegetables. They were planting a future. On the first day of true warmth, when the apple trees were blooming and the world smelled like growth and possibility, Vaughn rode to the village and spoke to the elder there, a man named Peter who served as the closest thing the valley had to a priest. He told Peter that he wanted to marry Gretna, and he asked if the elder would perform the ceremony. Peter was silent for a long time, his old face creased with thought. Then he said, "I have been thinking about you two all winter. Thinking about what it means that you are together, about whether it is right or wrong. And I have come to a conclusion." Vaughn waited, his heart in his throat. "The gods I serve teach that love is sacred," Peter said. "They teach that we are to care for each other, to build communities of kindness and support. They say nothing about what kind of person we are allowed to love. If you love her and she loves you, and that love makes you both better people, then who am I to stand in the way of it?" Relief flooded through Vaughn so powerfully that he had to sit down. "You will do it. You will marry us." "I will," Peter said. "But you should know that not everyone will approve. There may be consequences." "I know," Vaughn said, "but we are willing to face them." The wedding was set for the first day of summer, and as the date approached, Vaughn and Gretna prepared. Gretna sewed a dress from fabric that a leaner donated, cream-colored linen embroidered with green thread in patterns that echoed orc designs. Vaughn repaired his best shirt and trousers and polished his father's old belt buckle until it shone. They sent word to the valley, inviting anyone who wanted to come, and on the appointed day, Vaughn was stunned to see that nearly 40 people had gathered at the farm. Not the whole valley, not by far, but more than he had dared hope. There were people he knew well and people he barely recognized, farmers and craftspeople and even a few families with children. And at the back of the crowd, standing apart but present, was Nara, Gretna's grandmother. Gretna saw her and stopped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Grandmother," she breathed. The old orc woman walked forward slowly, leaning on a staff carved with intricate designs. She looked older than she had when Vaughn had last seen her, more frail, but her eyes were still sharp. "I cast you out," Nara said when she reached them. "I told you that you were no longer my granddaughter." "I remember," Gretna said, and her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "I was wrong," Nara said, and the words seemed to cost her. "I was afraid and angry, and I let that cloud my judgment. But I have spent this winter thinking, and I realized that you were the brave one. You chose love over hatred, hope over fear. You chose to build instead of destroy, and I should have stood with you." Gretna let out a sob and threw her arms around her grandmother, and Nara held her, both of them crying. Vaughn looked away to give them privacy, and his eyes met Peter's. The old human was smiling. When Gretna and Nara finally pulled apart, the old orc woman turned to Vaughn. "You have taken good care of my granddaughter," she said. "I have tried," Vaughn replied. "She has taken good care of me too." "That is as it should be," Nara said. "Marriage is a partnership, not a conquest. Remember that and you will do well." The ceremony was simple but beautiful. Peter spoke about love and commitment, about the courage it took to choose each other in a world that told them they should be enemies. Gretna recited the orc vows of kinship, declaring that Vaughn was her chosen family, the one she would stand beside through all the seasons of life. Vaughn spoke the human vows, promising to love and honor her, to be faithful in times of plenty and in times of hardship. They exchanged rings, simple bands that Thomas the blacksmith had made, and when Peter pronounced them married, the crowd cheered. It was not a universal cheer, and there were some faces in the crowd that remained stony and disapproving, but it was enough. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the valley had seen. Humans and orcs, the few who had come from Nara's clan, shared food and drink and stories. Children, human and orc alike, ran and played together. There was music, human fiddles and orc drums creating a sound that was strange but compelling. As the sun set and the party continued into the evening, Vaughn and Gretna slipped away to the porch of their house. They sat together on the steps, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and watched the stars come out. "You think this will last?" Gretna asked quietly. "This peace, this acceptance?" "I do not know," Vaughn said honestly. "There are still people who hate us, still people who think what we have done is wrong. But we have shown them that it is possible. We have proven that humans and orcs can live together, can love each other. That is something they can never take away." Gretna was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Nara told me something before the ceremony. She said that my mother wants to see me, that she regrets not speaking up when I was cast out. She asked if I would come visit, if I would bring you." "And what did you say?" Vaughn asked. "I said yes," Gretna replied. "I said we would come when the summer work is done, that we would meet her at the boundary stone and talk. I do not know if we can rebuild what was broken, but I want to try." Vaughn kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her, pine and herbs and home. "Then we will try," he said. "Together." The summer was long and productive, the fields yielding more than Vaughn had dared hope. He and Gretna worked from dawn until dusk, and in the evenings they often had visitors. People came to ask Gretna about herb lore, to have her look at a sick animal or a sick child. Orc traders began to pass through the valley, having heard that there was a place where they would not be immediately attacked, and they brought goods to trade, furs and carved items and medicinal plants that did not grow in human lands. Slowly, tentatively, the boundary between human and orc territory became less of a wall and more of a meeting place. There were still conflicts, still fights and accusations and fear, but there were also conversations, exchanges, moments of understanding. And at the center of it all were Vaughn and Gretna, the unlikely couple whose love had become a symbol of what was possible. In late summer, true to their promise, they traveled to the boundary stone to meet Gretna's mother. Vaughn was nervous, remembering the hostility of the orc settlement, but when they arrived, they found only 3 orcs waiting. Nara, a woman who could only be Gretna's mother, and a young orc male who Gretna said was her cousin. Gretna's mother, whose name was Vera, embraced her daughter for a long time, both of them weeping. Then she turned to Vaughn, and he saw where Gretna had gotten her amber eyes. "You are the human who loves my daughter," Vera said. "I am," Vaughn replied. "Then you are welcome in our family," Vera said simply. "I should have said so months ago. I should have stood with Gretna when she needed me. I can only ask for forgiveness and try to do better." They spent the afternoon talking, and Vaughn learned more about Gretna's family, about her father who had died fighting humans, but who had also been a musician, about her sister Mara, who had dreamed of healing the rift between their peoples. He shared stories of his own family, of Marcus and his parents, and as he talked, he saw the orc's expressions shift from wary to genuinely interested. When it was time to leave, Vera pressed a small pouch into Gretna's hands. "Seeds from your sister's garden," she said. "She would want you to have them. Plant them in your new home, and let something beautiful grow from all this grief." Gretna clutched the pouch to her chest, and Vaughn knew she would treasure it always. As they walked back toward the farm, Gretna said, "I never thought I would have this." My family back in my life, a home with you, a future that does not involve war. It feels like a dream." "If it is a dream," Vaughn said, taking her hand, "then I never want to wake up." The years that followed were not always easy. There were still those who opposed their union, still incidents of violence and hatred. But there were also victories, small and large. Other human-orc couples began to form, inspired by Vaughn and Gretna's example. The boundary stone became a place where people from both sides met to trade and talk. Children grew up knowing orcs and humans as neighbors rather than as monsters. Vaughn and Gretna had children of their own, 3 daughters who had their mother's green skin and their father's blue eyes, who were taught to be proud of both their heritages. They grew up speaking both languages, learning both customs, and they became ambassadors in their own right, proof that human and orc could not only coexist, but could create something new and beautiful together. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Vaughn and Gretna stood at the boundary stone where they had first met. The stone had been carved now, decorated with symbols from both cultures, and it had become a monument not to war but to peace, to the possibility of change. "Do you remember the first time we met here?" Gretna asked, her hand in Vaughn's. "I remember thinking you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen," Vaughn said. "And I remember being terrified because you were an orc and I was supposed to hate you." "I remember thinking you looked lost," Gretna said. "Like you were carrying a weight too heavy for one person. I wanted to help, even though I knew I should not." "I am glad you did," Vaughn said. "I am glad we both chose to see past 100 years of war to the people underneath." Gretna leaned against him, and they stood together in silence, watching the sun set over the borderlands that were no longer a boundary but a bridge. Behind them, they could hear their daughters playing, their laughter mixing with the laughter of human and orc children alike. "We did it," Gretna said softly. "We actually did it." "We did," Vaughn agreed. "We built something better." And as the stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had watched 100 years of war, Vaughn and Gretna stood together, proof that love could be stronger than hatred, that hope could overcome fear, and that 2 people meeting at a boundary stone could change the world. The farm thrived in the years that followed, becoming a hub for the growing community of humans and orcs who had chosen to live together in peace. Vaughn expanded the house, adding rooms for their growing family and for the visitors who increasingly came to learn from their example. Gretna's herb garden became famous throughout the region, and people traveled from far and wide to seek her healing knowledge. Their eldest daughter, Marina, inherited her mother's gift for healing and her father's patience, and by the time she was 15, she was already apprenticing with healers from both human and orc communities. Their middle daughter, Ilara, had her father's love of the land and spent her days working the fields and experimenting with new crops, trying to find varieties that would grow well in both human and orc territories. Their youngest, Kira, was wild and adventurous, always disappearing into the woods and returning with stories of the creatures she had befriended and the places she had explored. Vaughn watched his daughters grow with a mixture of pride and wonder. They were so confident, so comfortable in their own skins, in a way that he and Gretna had never been able to be at their age. They did not apologize for being half-orc, did not try to hide their heritage. They wore it proudly, and in doing so, they made the world a little bit safer for others like them. One spring morning, when Marina was 17, she came to Vaughn with a request. "Father," she said, "there is an orc boy from the northern clans. His name is Torin, and he has been studying healing with Mother. We have become close, and I would like your permission to court him." Vaughn looked at his daughter, at the hope and nervousness in her eyes, and felt his heart swell. "You have my permission," he said, "and my blessing." Does your mother know? She knows, Marina said, smiling. She said to ask you because it was important that both my parents approve. We approve, Vaughn said. Invite him to dinner. We would like to meet him properly. Torin came to dinner that evening. A young orc male with kind eyes and careful manners, and Vaughn and Gretna spent the evening getting to know him. He was intelligent and thoughtful, passionate about healing work, and the way he looked at Marina made Vaughn remember the way he had looked at Gretna all those years ago at the Boundary Stone. After Torin left, Gretna came and sat beside Vaughn on the porch. Our daughter is courting, she said. When did she get old enough for that? I have been wondering the same thing, Vaughn said. It seems like just yesterday she was learning to walk. He is a good boy, Gretna said. From a good family, his parents are among those who have been working to end the hostilities between our peoples. I am glad, Vaughn said. I want her to be happy. I want all of them to be happy. Gretna leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their land. 20 years had passed since that first meeting at the Boundary Stone, and the world had changed so much. There were still conflicts, still people who clung to the old hatreds, but there were also places where humans and orcs lived side by side, where children of both species played together, where love was allowed to flourish regardless of what skin it wore. You ever regret it? Vaughn asked. Choosing me, leaving your clan? Never, Gretna said immediately. Not for a single moment. You gave me a life I never could have imagined, a family I treasure more than anything. I would make the same choice 1,000 times over. Vaughn kissed her forehead, breathing in the familiar scent of her. I love you, he said. I have loved you since that first day at the Boundary Stone, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Gretna replied. My husband, my partner, my heart. The seasons continued to turn, bringing changes and challenges. There was a harsh winter when the crops failed and the community had to band together to survive, humans and orcs sharing resources and labor. There was a summer of sickness when a fever swept through the valley, and Gretna worked day and night to heal the afflicted, aided by Marina and several orc healers who had come to help. Through it all, Vaughn and Gretna stood together, their partnership a model for others, their love a beacon that showed what was possible when people chose to see each other as individuals rather than as enemies. When Vaughn was 52 and Gretna was 49, they received word that the human king and the orc high chieftain had agreed to meet for the first time in a century. The meeting was to take place at the Boundary Stone, the place that had become a symbol of peace and possibility, and Vaughn and Gretna were invited to attend as witnesses and advisors. They traveled to the Boundary Stone with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was a moment that could change everything, that could end the war officially and create a lasting peace, or it could collapse into violence and set back all the progress that had been made. When they arrived, they found that a great pavilion had been erected near the stone, and hundreds of people, human and orc alike, had gathered to witness the historic meeting. Vaughn saw familiar faces in the crowd. Eleanor, now ancient and bent but still sharp-eyed, Thomas the blacksmith, who had become one of their staunchest allies, Sarah, whose child Gretna had healed years ago and who now brought her own grandchildren to play with orc youngsters. On the orc side, he saw Nara, still alive at an age that seemed impossible, and Vera, Gretna's mother, who had become a leader among those orcs who advocated for peace. He saw young orcs and old, warriors and farmers and craftspeople, all gathered to see if this impossible thing could actually happen. The king arrived first, a middle-aged man with gray in his beard and weariness in his eyes. He had lost sons to the war, Vaughn knew, and the loss had changed him, made him question the value of continuing a conflict that had already cost so much. The High Chieftain arrived moments later, a massive orc woman with scars covering her arms and a presence that commanded immediate respect. She had been a warrior once, one of the fiercest, but she had put down her weapons years ago after her entire family was killed in a single battle. They met at the boundary stone, and the crowd fell silent, hundreds of people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. The king spoke first. "We have been at war for 100 years," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering. 100 years of death and destruction, of families torn apart and futures destroyed. I am tired of it. I am tired of sending young men and women to die for land that will mean nothing if we are all dead. I am tired of grieving. The High Chieftain nodded slowly. "I am tired too," she said. "Tired of losing my people to a fight that has gone on so long we have forgotten why we are fighting. Tired of seeing children grow up knowing only war. We need something different." "I propose," the king said, "that we end this war, not with surrender or conquest, but with a treaty. A recognition that both our peoples have a right to exist, a right to the land we live on. I propose that we create a lasting peace." The High Chieftain was silent for a long moment, and Vaughn could see the struggle in her expression, the weight of 100 years of hatred and fear. But then she looked out at the crowd, at the humans and orcs who had gathered together, at the children playing at the edges of the pavilion, and something in her face softened. "I accept," she said. "Let us end this war. Let us build a peace." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Vaughn found himself holding Gretna tightly, both of them crying. It was not perfect, and there would still be challenges, still people who could not let go of the old hatreds. But it was a beginning, a real and meaningful beginning, and it was more than either of them had ever dared hope for. In the weeks that followed, the treaty was formalized, boundaries were established, and trade agreements were negotiated. Vaughn and Gretna were asked to serve as ambassadors, to help facilitate communication between the two peoples, and they accepted, knowing that their unique position gave them a responsibility to help build the peace that was emerging. Their farm became an official meeting place, neutral ground where humans and orcs could come to discuss issues and resolve conflicts. Vaughn found himself playing host to delegations from both sides, mediating disputes, helping to build the trust that was essential for the peace to last. Gretna trained healers from both peoples, teaching them to work together, to combine human and orc healing knowledge into something more effective than either tradition alone. Marina and Torin married in a ceremony that brought together hundreds of guests from both species, and their wedding became another symbol of what was possible. The years continued to pass, and Vaughn grew old, his hair turning white and his body becoming slower and stiffer. But his mind remained sharp, and his love for Gretna never wavered. She aged too, her green skin becoming darker and more weathered, her tusks yellowing, but to him, she was as beautiful as the day he had first seen her at the boundary stone. On their 30th anniversary, they returned to the stone, just the two of them, and stood where they had first met. The stone was covered in carvings now, names and dates and symbols, a record of all the moments of peace and understanding that had taken place there. 30 years, Gretna said, running her fingers over the carved stone. 30 years since we chose each other over 100 years of war. Best decision I ever made, Vaughn said, taking her hand. Mine too, Gretna agreed. She looked out over the borderlands, which were no longer a place of conflict but a place where farms and settlements from both peoples existed side by side. We did more than we ever imagined we could, did we not? We did, Vaughn said. We helped end a war. We raised 3 beautiful daughters. We built a community where humans and orcs can live together in peace. Not bad for a couple of mourners who met at a boundary stone." Gretna laughed, the sound rich and warm, and Vaughn felt his heart swell with love. They had faced so much together, overcome so many obstacles, and through it all, their love had only grown stronger. "I am getting old," Vaughn said quietly. "I can feel it in my bones, the way the winters are harder now, the way I tire more easily." "We are both getting old," Gretna said. "But we are getting old together, and that is all that matters." They stood together as the sun set, casting long shadows across the borderlands, and Vaughn thought about all the moments that had led them to this place. The grief that had brought them both to the stone originally. The courage it had taken to keep meeting, to admit their feelings, to choose each other despite the opposition. The joy of building a life together, of raising children, of being part of something larger than themselves. "You think," Vaughn said, "that Marcus and Mara would be proud of us? That they would approve of what we have built?" Gretna was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I think they would be amazed. I think they would be honored that their deaths, as senseless and tragic as they were, led to something good. That out of all that loss and grief, we found each other and built something that has helped so many people." "I like to think so too," Vaughn said. As the stars began to appear overhead, they turned and walked back toward home, toward the farm that had become so much more than just a place to live. It was a symbol, a beacon, a testament to the power of love to overcome hatred, of hope to triumph over despair. Their daughters met them at the door, Marina with her husband Torin and their 2 young children, Elara with her human husband James and their newborn son, Kira with her orc partner Shara and their adopted daughter. The house was full of noise and laughter and life, and Vaughn stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, memorizing this moment of perfect joy. Gretna came and stood beside him, slipping her hand into his. "Our family," she said softly. "Human and orc, mixed and blended and all the more beautiful for it." "Our family," Vaughn agreed. "Our legacy." That night, after the children and grandchildren had gone to their own homes or to the guest rooms to sleep, Vaughn and Gretna lay together in the bed they had shared for 30 years. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting everything in shades of silver, and Vaughn held his wife close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her body against his. "Promise me something," Gretna said quietly. "Anything," Vaughn replied. "Promise me that when one of us is gone, the other will keep living, will keep building this peace we have worked so hard for. Promise me that our story will not end with death, but will continue in our children and their children." Vaughn felt tears prick his eyes, but he nodded. "I promise," he said, "though I hope that day is very far away." "As do I," Gretna said, "as do I." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, and they both dreamed of the boundary stone, of the moment they had first met, of all the years that had followed, of all the love and hope and possibility that had grown from a single act of choosing to see past hatred to the person underneath. The peace between humans and orcs held and grew stronger with each passing year. There were still challenges, still conflicts and misunderstandings, but the framework was there now, the structures and relationships that allowed those conflicts to be resolved without violence. The boundary stone became a place of pilgrimage, where people came to remember the cost of war and to celebrate the possibility of peace. Vaughn and Gretna lived to see their grandchildren grow, to see the world transform in ways they had never imagined possible. And when they were old and gray and had lived full and meaningful lives, they passed away within a day of each other, as if neither could bear to be without the other for long. They were buried together at the boundary stone, and their grave became a monument, a place where people from both species came to pay their respects, and to remember the two people whose love had helped change the world. Their daughters carried on their work, continuing to build bridges between humans and orcs, and their grandchildren did the same, and their great-grandchildren after them. The farm remained a meeting place, a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over hatred, hope over fear. And every year, on the anniversary of that first meeting at the Boundary Stone, people gathered to tell the story of Vaughn and Gretna, of the human man and the orc woman who had met in grief and found love, who had faced impossible odds and built something beautiful, who had proven that even 100 years of war could not stand against the power of two people choosing each other. Their story became legend, passed down through generations, a reminder that peace was always possible, that love could bridge any divide, and that sometimes the most courageous thing a person could do was to choose to see the humanity in someone they had been taught to hate. The Boundary Stone still stands, weathered and worn but enduring, covered in carvings and offerings, a monument to the moment when everything changed. And if you listen closely on quiet evenings, some say you can still hear echoes of that first meeting, of two voices speaking across a century of war, choosing hope, choosing each other, choosing love.